Right, thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating afternoon. I did some thought, obviously, ahead of coming here about some things that I thought might end up making sense to say, but I wanted to, the task was to try and draw together and think about some of the implications of the three presentations that we've heard. So I didn't want to sort of restrict myself too much. So I think what I'm going to do is three things. I just want to firstly pull out a couple of points that have kind of stayed with me throughout the course of these three presentations that feel like they're linked and feel like they are, for me anyway, quite interesting in light of the policy context. Then I'll go through these two ideas, I guess, and just say a few words. This is based on, I guess, the approach that we take at the New Economics Foundation to thinking about some of this stuff. So looking at what we're talking about in terms of stronger towns as a local manifestation of problems that are structural. And that's something that I think about quite a lot when we're talking about this stuff, that has implications for what are the policy recommendations and are the policy recommendations about trying to fix the places that were so presumptuous as to exclude themselves from the economy, or is it about trying to fix a structure which excludes those places and that kind of thing. And then I just thought I'd finish by these will be a very personal, viewpoint on what the kind of current political challenges and possibly opportunities are in terms of making policy recommendations. And I suppose just before that to say, for those of you who don't know, so the New Economics Foundation is a think tank. It likes to call itself a think and do tank. We don't just do research and policy work, but we do quite a lot of practice-based work. And actually my work in particular as Director of Programmes and Practice involves working a lot with institutions that are place-based, so local authorities, but also civil society organisations and also private sector, private businesses, and traders associations and chambers of commerce around the country to think about the manifestation of policy in practice, what it looks like when it's going wrong. And I suppose my personal viewpoint is that generally, in my experience of doing this work in the last 15 odd years, is that the most useful, interesting and workable policy ideas that I come across tend to come from people who are delivering things in practice, who understand why it's not working in practice, who understand how the central policy would need to change to make it work in their locality. Those tend to be the people who are furthest away from the rooms where policy is being made. And so that's just something that also revolves around how we think about these things quite a lot. So just starting off with just some reflections that I was capturing throughout. When the Stronger Towns Fund was announced in March, and I was sort of looking at it, it struck me that there were sort of three problems that I had with it. The first was kind of obvious, was the amount, and there was a lot of discussion in the press of, is this really, if you compare the amount that was announced, 1.6 billion, with, for example, the amount of cumulative cuts that had been made to local authority devolved grant over the period of, time of austerity, it didn't feel like a very big amount. So there was quite a lot of discussion about, is it enough? So that's obviously a thing. The second was how it was being proposed to be distributed. So my work with local authorities on local economic regeneration, particularly in towns, but also in cities and in city regions, repeatedly throws up this tension, which I'll talk a little bit more about, between different kinds of economic outcomes that different groups perceive to be important. So there is a set of economic outcomes essentially around productivity and contribution to GDP, which go up when you do certain things in the economy, when you stimulate certain sectors. And then there are other kinds of economic outcomes which tend to be more interesting to, I suppose, local citizens, local authorities, when they're people when they're thinking about what it's like to live in the place that they live, which are to do with, wage levels, unemployment, socioeconomic factors. And often the things that you do to drive forward growth per se, it turns out, don't necessarily generate those other outcomes. And I think London is the prime example of that. London contributes upwards of 23% of the country's GDP and has the highest adult and child poverty rates. So we know that having an area in which a lot of economic activity is happening per se doesn't necessarily mean that people who live in that area all equally feel benefit of that. And so there's a question about what kind of economic development, what kind of business sector does deliver the sort of socio-economic outcomes that people are interested in, and can you do both at the same time? And one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations I have is that LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, are explicitly mandated. It's not their fault. They are mandated by the government to be pursuing GVA, essentially GVA, GDP targets when they think about what kinds of economic interventions need to be made. And that they are often named as a part of the problem of where the tension comes when I'm talking to local authority regeneration teams or community organisations. And it just struck me that the Stronger Towns Fund was suggesting that the fund be distributed through LEPs, and I was sort of wondering whether that could be expected to generate a particularly different economic outcome than the one that we see already, that we understand to have led to the feeling that people have in towns of being left behind in the first place. And then the third thing that sort of struck me was, I suppose what I've already said is, okay, so we have an economic system which is absolutely geared around cities, around agglomeration, because that is, what is perceived to be the most useful way of increasing productivity in the way that we increase it. What flows from that is an idea that essentially what you need is big conurbations where lots of economic activities happen, and then areas possibly of dormitory suburbs that sit around them. We design our transport infrastructure in that way. This has evolved over many, many years. There's a lot of path dependency that's been baked into that. And as a result, I would argue that the issues that we see in towns and the left behind places debate is that is a symptom of this system. So if you are then making funding available, which is trying to patch up the symptom, I suppose there was a question in my head of what do you do with this money? And if you put a little bit of money in the places that are struggling, how far does that really shift the system that is generating these problems in the first place? And I think that came through quite strongly, actually, through all of the presentations. I thought it was very interesting. The first, Tony's presentation at the beginning, talking about, thinking very carefully about how to figure out who is in most need of this funding. Then obviously the question is, what then should be done with it in those places? And that seemed to me to revolve, again, around this question of, what problem is it that you might be fixing, and to what degree can you really fix the crux of the problem, or are you stuck with just patching it up, and which institution are you channeling the money through? That impacts on that. That got me thinking about sort of work that we do quite a lot on. There are sort of two aspects to prosperity in towns, which came through, I thought, very strongly from actually all three presentations, particularly the first two, which one is around revenue, the amount of income people have, and that's essentially, do they have access to a job or don't they, and is that job very well paid? Do they have revenue? But the other one is, do they have wealth? Do they own their house? Do they have the ability to derive income not from waged labour? Does that give them a certain amount of freedom to do other things? And that obviously kind of came up several times in presentations. The kinds of economic interventions you might want to make are possibly different around, if you increase the number of jobs and well-paid jobs, that's great, you're increasing revenue, but as we've seen in terms of how our housing market works, that's only a very small picture, actually, of the disparities that we see in economic levels of security and how that plays out into health and so on. So then you're sort of thinking about, well, when you invest in economic activity, if you're an individual or if you're a company, and you invest in economic activity in somewhere like Grimsby or Hull, if you are persuaded to do that, and you put money in and business economic activity starts to increase in that area, who is generating the profits from that economic activity? So it's great if more wages are going to local community, but is that community being asset stripped? Are the proceeds of that getting sucked out through the returns on the investment of who made the investment? And a lot of work that NEF does is thinking about who ends up with the ownership. So if you are spending public money, whether that's through the Stronger Towns Fund or anything else, if you are spending public money in investing in economic development with the idea that you are creating self-sustaining economic activity that generates a dividend, a profit, where is that profit going to land? Are you essentially putting public money into activities for which the profit will then get sucked away from that community, or are you locking it into local money flows and supply chains? And then I think, and there were many, many more things that came out, and I won't go into loads of detail, but I think it was really interesting also that just a point that struck me in the final presentation about the value of this kind of longitudinal way of thinking, and about how people's earlier experiences and earlier parts of their lives massively impact how things are playing out for them in later parts of their lives, often over a 30 or 40-year time frame. That also chimes, it's not the same, but it chimes with something that we think about a lot, and therefore when we're thinking about the logic behind city growth deals and devolution deals, the idea that, you say, right, from the central government, right, we're going to invest some more money in these places that are not doing as well as London. That's great, and it's going to be conditional. You're going to get the money based on how rapidly you raise your GVA contributions, how rapidly you increase your economic activity. If you ask a place to massively increase its GVA growth in a 3 or a 5 year period, that is not long enough to send a generation of kids through a full schooling system, right? So what that means is if you're going to be importing new economic sectors or in growing new economic sectors in somewhere like Manchester or Sheffield, and you don't currently have the labour force to staff them, and you are trying to do that within a 5 year period, you have to be relocating people from other places. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe what you're doing is attracting back all the kids who left in the first place from that area. That's great. But what, of course, you do see is gentrification. You see, we did a piece of work about 3 years ago on the Manchester devolution deal where, I won't name who it was, but a senior official in the council who was talking about their housing policy said, well, the way that we're using our 45 million investment in the housing sector as Manchester is, of course, the kind of housing stock we have in Greater Manchester is not the kind of housing that the kinds of people who we want to live and work in Manchester want to live in. So we want to build houses that will attract people who are currently essentially working in London and South East to come, and what does that say for the people who are living in Collyhurst, who are not going to have access to those jobs? So those are sort of some thoughts. I'm realising I've probably covered some of what I'd had here, so I'll skip through this. But so essentially, I wanted to just share this kind of way of thinking. So I work a lot on local economies, and when I first joined New Economics Foundation about 5 years ago, I sort of came into this job, and my background had been in community and youth work, and then sort of child poverty policy, so really a social policy background. And I said, right, I'm here, so local economy. So just tell me, what do we mean by local economy? Are we talking 6 mile radius? Are we talking 30 miles? Are we talking about travel to work area? What's the definition? It became very quickly clear that there isn't an agreed definition. Lots of different people have lots of different definitions. And so I began to think about just almost just as a kind of a rubric that I could just hold in my head when I was trying to talk to lots of different people who had different ideas about this, that there are many different definitions, but these 3 seem to come up a lot in the conversation I have. So there's the lived experience of the economy in a place. If you talk to somebody, I'm doing work in Grimsby at the moment, you talk to people in East Marsh and Grimsby, and you say, what's your local economy like? The answers they give will be essentially about their lived experience. And I think that's come up in several of the presentations here that we've talked about people's lived experience of the economy. How far away is a relatively decent job, or is there one? How easy is it for you to get to that job? So if you're a certain kind of person, you might be able to get on the train for 20 minutes to a job. If you're somebody with caring responsibilities or has to pick your kid up from nursery at 3 o'clock or school from 3 o'clock, your local economy is different from your next door neighbour who doesn't have to do that. So it's quite a human understanding of what the economy is. And that definition of the economy, obviously local authorities think about that a lot, because the people who elect their members think about that a lot. Then there's the kind of how the economy functions locally. So if you're the local chamber of commerce, or you are the local authority regeneration team, or business development team, you're of course thinking about what kind of business space do we have? How many small, medium enterprises are there versus bigger ones? What are the local supply chains like? How well are businesses locally able to tap into other opportunities that are coming in? So you're thinking about the mechanics of it, which is slightly different. And then if you are sitting in the Treasury and you talk about the local economy and who has a strong local economy and who doesn't, and this comes out in the definitions, or the kind of the characteristics that were mentioned in the Stronger Towns Fund when it was announced, you're thinking about how the local area contributes nationally. If you look at all of, in the devolution deals were being cooked up, you looked at all of George Osborne's speeches about that and talking about why they wanted to kind of turbocharge and boost the northern economies. The definition of that was increasing that region's contribution to the national pot, essentially. GVA, growing your the regional contribution to the overall national pot. And that's very different again. These are 3 very different kind of understandings of what local economy is. And I'll skip over this because I think everybody here is familiar. This is just a kind of exploration of what people mean by the lived experience of the local economy. So that was kind of the first thought I wanted to share. The second one, which I think is really important, is, and this really resonates with a lot of presentations, is I'm asked a lot about we talk now a lot about inclusive growth. It seems to have caught on, the idea that growth as we know it hasn't been very inclusive, and what could we do to do it? And we also more recent years, Preston model community wealth building has become a bit of an idea and a concept, and there are new terms springing up all the time. I'm asked a lot, are these different things? Are they the same? Does it matter? Can you substitute one word for the other? And essentially, I think most of the time people, when they start talking about inclusive growth or inclusive economies, do mean the same thing. They mean an economy that functions better for more people than it currently does at the moment. But there is a crucial difference, and I think it's quite helpful to think about this, and it relates to this point at the beginning about what then do we do to fix the problems that we've identified in the place we identify. So this is very, very reductionist, but essentially if you think about, okay, we're thinking about people who are excluded from the benefits of the local economy, whether you're thinking about that in London and, within a rich city there are pockets of poverty, or whether you're thinking about that across the UK, we know there are areas which we think of as left behind areas. When we're thinking about inclusive economy, we think, well, how do we, how could we make these people not excluded from the economy? And then you have the economy, or the local economy, from which they are excluded. And there are various different interventions that we then try and make. If you are coming from public services or a training and skills or a voluntary sector support, social work type, field, background, you're thinking very much about how do we support those people who can't get the jobs locally, who are excluded, to cope better. How can we support the kids with no skills to have some skills so that they could apply for the job? How do we support the person who's got long-term mental health issues to feel a bit less isolated and a bit braver and go out and get a job? You're focusing on the people. If you're an economic development team, you're thinking about, well, how do we change the local economy to make it cater better to local people's needs? And essentially, the inclusive growth story really focuses on, in my view, how do you get people who are excluded from the local economy to be able to participate better in it? The onus is on the people who are excluded, even if it's quite a positive frame of, investing time and resources and services and development on those people. But the idea, if you read the RSA's Inclusive Growth Commission report, most of the measures in the intervention it talks about are around training and skills and around, social infrastructure support and investing in the voluntary sector, all of which are incredibly important, because if you don't do that, you're sort of screwed. But they're not really on shifting the structural shape of the economy that has really, really low-paid jobs and a hollowed-out middle, and then lots of high-paid jobs that are inaccessible to people. So essentially, if you're taking more of an economic development point of view, which is kind of where the community wealth building approach starts, although I think it's one part of a very big puzzle, and there's lots of other things that people are not talking about yet, it's sort of focusing on that. So I think that's important for this, that's a question in my head. If you're looking at the Stronger Towns Fund, what's it going to do? You could say, right, with this money, we're Grimsby, with this money, we are going to stick a load of money in local young people education. We're going to invest in the most disadvantaged communities and put some services on for them, and then hopefully more of them will be able to tap into the job sector. Or you could be looking at, do we stimulate the business base? Do we look at the kinds of sectors that could provide the kinds of jobs that would be accessible to people and develop more of them? There is a tension, which goes back to the first slide about the three different understandings of local economy, which is a bit of an elephant in the room. If you are going for, and this is what I said before already, if you're going for kind of rapid growth, if you're looking, if you're looking at that list of places that we saw at the very beginning, those 20 places that are the kind of, we have the weakest economies, and you're thinking, how do we get those economies to be more productive? And that will be our measure of success. You want them to have lots more high growth sectors in them quickly, which means you have the labour market requirements and the infrastructure requirements for that, and you probably want to attract inward investment to do that. But you risk displacement, gentrification, exclusion as people are priced out because you're doing it in a way. If you go for the kind of social and environmental priorities, that's great. You think, right, what's the existing population base here? And it ties to the point you were making about older people. What skills do people have? What could they develop in the next 10 to 15 years? What kind of sectors would be meaningful for this community? What kind of businesses would provide the kinds of jobs that are already accessible to the community? How do you foster that? Lots of small and medium businesses, lots of middle level of the economy jobs. That's great, and you invest in long-term community development and long-term skills development. You grow pretty slowly, and you don't grow massively much necessarily in terms of economic activity. So that's an issue, and that's an issue in an economy that is still very, very centralised, and in a geography in England which is massively unequal. So that you don't fix the inequality of where wealth is spread if you do that. So those are just a few reflections on some of the kind of structural ideas that we certainly are trying to puzzle out all the time at the New Economics Foundation. Don't always have the answers, but I think which are really relevant in this conversation about towns. If you really want to support towns to do better within the current structure of the economy, you probably need an economy that is not designed to go after the kind of growth that is best delivered by agglomerated cities. And as long as that's what you're going for, you are going to get left behind towns. There's not really, that's the issue really. In terms of the policy environment, so these were just a few thoughts I had. I think we can all agree there been a massive paradigm shift since the Brexit referendum. I think, at all levels, at all parts of the political spectrum, there is a genuine recognition of the fact that people living in different parts of the country experience the economy in different ways, and that many people feel like the economy is not doing it for them. It feels like we sort of, that is now accepted. That's great. I don't think that's going to change. But my feeling is that there is a massive variation in people's understanding of how deep and how structural this is, both in terms, actually across left and right. So I think that there is still a tendency, whether on the left or the right at the moment, to focus on how do we distribute wealth more equally, which of course is extremely important. But it feels to me like that's where the debate often stops, rather than thinking about what kind of economy do we have, and how would you have a more decentralized economy? What would that look like? What interventions would you need to make that happen? What kinds of sectors would you need to favour to make that happen? Thinking about some of the work that Kresk, Carol Williams and Julie Froud have done on the foundational economy. Do we actually start investing in the sectors that are very easy to root in their communities, utilities, hairdressing, retail, colleges, as opposed to financial services sector or other high growth sectors that are very mobile. Of course, there's also the risk, just in terms of just thinking about what work can be done in the next 2 years, that there is so much else going on. As somebody mentioned, since the Stronger Towns Fund was announced on the 4th of March, very little, I think nothing else has come out about it in sort of public domain. I don't think that's an accident. There is so much else going on that this stuff just kind of sinks to the bottom of the rest of it. And I think that's a challenge for academics and sort of think tanky people alike, in terms of how do you cut through what are going to be useful policy recommendations, where do you go. I think I really apologise for how ugly this slide is. I'm not big on graphic design, as you probably realise. This is just an attempt on my part to get my thoughts straight. What I think is that there is a basic difference in opinion that I encounter between people who work at a national level and people who work at a local level about what the solutions might look like. That is the same across left and right, although it manifests, there will be slightly different ideas that people sort of are their go-to ideas depending where they are. So on a national level, sort of on a more left-wing side of things, there's the idea that of, more tax and spend, have a great, healthy economy, tax it, spend that money on the good social services that we need. On the right hand, there's, moving further over to the right, there's the idea that, maybe it's not about tax and spend, but it is about making pots of money available for specific problems that need specific solutions, and we appreciate that sometimes you do need to kind of stimulate that investment. If you look at the local level, what I hear from local authorities and people working at the local level is much more about how you strengthen the fabric of an economy in a place, which is the stuff that doesn't actually necessarily lead to very rapid GVA growth, and doesn't seem to get that much traction really once you're talking to somebody from the Treasury or from central government. Whether that's sort of a more kind of community-led economic development angle, whether that's what you might hear from your local Chamber of Commerce saying that we just need a bit more money pumping into our local economy and we can do the rest. Those are probably, in my view, the kinds of interventions that are more likely to stimulate local development usefully, but with the caveat that none of this actually tackles what I started off with, which is the idea that the structural problem of the national economy is what's feeding this. So you can do as much community economic development as you like in Grimsby. Grimsby still doesn't have the Isle of Dogs in it, and it never will, and our economy is still focused on that. So I do sort of feel like there's a massive challenge which we're all facing. There's a kind of medium challenge, which is that where policy gets made tends to be in institutions which tend to be populated by people who live in cities, who have mostly lived most of their lives in cities, and the people who live and have lived most of their lives in places which are not cities do not tend to be the people who have their hands on the levers of power, and there is this division of I think that is something that needs, could be usefully thought of in research. But fundamentally, really, my question is, okay, if you are going to make money, if we are going to kind of put energy and money into trying to fix this, what would it look like to, fix it structurally? And really, I think that looks like a completely different industrial strategy, a completely different approach to infrastructure and transport. Of course, the house building comes into it as well. And all of those things don't look like making small bits of money available to Barnsley. Which is not to say that I don't also think, of course, there should be plenty more money being pumped into local areas. It's not one or the other. That, I will stop there. And apologies, that was a little bit of a scattergun approach, but it was partly a function of me trying to prepare some stuff and be ready to respond to some things. So just throwing some thoughts out there, really. Thank you.
You still have this? Marvellous. That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. I hope that was really thought-provoking. I certainly found it so. Any questions? And I suppose at this stage of the day, sort of wider thoughts and summings up as well.
Thank you. James Jennings, UCL Innovation and Enterprise. Thank you for your presentation. It's really useful. Did work with you guys many moons ago when I worked in Lambeth regarding Brixton Pound. And it's actually the starting point for the actual introduction of that was to develop a grassroots approach to kind of like an economic problem in terms of how do we revive Brixton, but also from the council standpoint is how could we bring investment, so it's kind of bringing those two aspects together. So it's been introduced and it's been really successful, but actually it's become a victim of its own success because it's brought in that inward investment. That inward investment has brought a lot of seed funding in, and it's actually exacerbated the situation of local businesses not being able to stay there and to actually leave. So in essence, there could be some interventions that really work, but in essence, they could have some unintended consequences. And I remember us doing the equality impact assessment over that, and that could have been a consequence, but we didn't really figure it out then. We just thought, okay, this is a really good idea, keep businesses there to bring in small businesses, but it's had other unintended consequences. So I suppose the thought is with, potentially, if there are interventions that could be designed in that manner, there are unintended consequences looking at further down the line and stuff. So, any comments on that? So.
Shall I respond one by one? That's a really good case study in a way. I think where my current thinking is at on that, I mean, the local currencies are an interesting one, and they've been around, been around for a while, and I think people's thinking about them has developed in different ways. And I think there is an understanding that there are some really useful things about doing it. A lot of the useful things actually are to do with developing a positive identity around an area. It's a very useful marketing exercise. And so, there's lots of, but whether it's a useful economic stimulus it's still a bit moot. I think, so it's interesting thinking about, say, the Preston model, which, starts with the idea that, okay, you've got an area where there's not much money coming in, post-austerity, they were hit very hard by the financial crash and by austerity. How can we maximise? How can we basically increase the amount of money that's coming into the pipeline into this area? Great. The way we do that is we look at, being more efficient with how we spend money that we were going to spend anyway and spend it locally. So that's great. That's about putting money into an area. Interestingly, in many areas, actually including Preston, that still risks having the same effect, which is that that just increases the demand. But if you're not increasing the supply side, and if you're not enabling existing local cohorts of people to be accessing that demand, you still haven't really fixed the problem. You've just possibly attracted a bunch of other people in who displaced them. So I think really the answer is around working on that other side. It sounds very mundane and boring, but business support packages. Doing a piece of work at the moment with Barking and Dagenham Council, which I was chatting to Ken about earlier. What kinds of businesses do you want to see working and operating in an area? Thinking about which kinds of businesses are going to be able to offer decent, good quality jobs to the people in the area that are accessible, and then how do you support the local population to be running those businesses? That's really the intervention that you're thinking about, which is all sorts of things, and it could be, there's ranges of programs from, low interest loan funds through to kind of one-on-one support packages, through to mentorship schemes, through to all sorts of different things that form part of the package. So, stimulating that that type of economic growth in a very mindful way, I guess. Yeah.
Linked to that, well, obviously, I've enjoyed all the today. It's been really stimulating. Linked to that, perhaps we could look at your proposition in a slightly different way. That is to say, strengthening not just the economic fabric, but strengthening the social fabric. Now, by strengthening the social fabric, we could mean at least four things. One, the development of the structure of the economy, which could be seen as a combination economy. That's to say, it will have different skill levels within it, foundational, intermediate, and high. Secondly, linked to the issue this morning about housing, it's about sustainable living, so people can afford to stay in an area, particularly, for instance, on the edge of London, which feels like a town as being part of a larger city. Thirdly, and critically, how you develop the skill supply, because I know that further education colleges are not funded to think ahead. They think for the present. But you need a 5 to 10 year view about skills escalators in order to include local populations. And that then means you have to have a chrono perspective of the social evolution of an area over time.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there are four elements of strengthening the fabric. And then you have to think about the role of the national state as a facilitating state that deliberately devolves powers because people on the ground know better how to work out those combinations. And it seems to me that that's the kind of combinational approach which I think your presentation is, in my language, is actually presenting.
Yeah, what he said, basically. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that that's exactly right. The thing that is interesting there is, I suppose, on the final point about why it is therefore useful to devolve powers locally, because, and that's certainly borne out by my experiences, that, you know, basically people in local areas have a better sense of what's going to make that happen. What, of course, I don't think is that the devolution exercise that has been going on over the last sort of 5 to 10 years has done that, basically because it's sort of, you know, having said, yes, we'll devolve powers to local because they know how to grow the economy better, what it was asking them to deliver was this GVA-based thing. So devolving local powers, as well as essentially devolving the ability to set priorities locally, rather than devolving local powers to enable local actors to deliver nationally set priorities which focus on GVA growth. So, which is what you're saying, I know, but I think that's the kind of the tension point within it, which is important.